In the mountains of Southeast Asia, there are valleys where the forest canopy grows, so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. Villages appear unexpectedly along narrow footpaths, their wooden houses raised above rice fields that have sustained generations. The air carries the scent of damp soil and wood smoke from cooking fires. For centuries, life here moved according to rhythms that seemed almost timeless. Yet beneath this peaceful landscape lies the legacy of one of the most intense and least visible conflicts of the 20th century, a war that, for many years, officially did not exist. Between 1961 and 1973, thousands of aircraft thundered across these mountains. Bombs fell in staggering numbers, reshaping valleys and hillsides. Covert armies moved through dense jungles. Intelligence officers coordinated battles from hidden airstrips. Entire communities became part of a conflict that most of the world barely knew was taking place. It came to be known as the Secret War, and in many ways, its story is still unfolding. How does a war remain largely unseen by the outside world? And what happens to a nation when its battles are hidden not only from its enemies, but from history itself? To understand the secret war in Laos, the story must begin before the bombs fell, before covert operations spread across the country, before global superpowers transformed a small mountain kingdom into a front line of the Cold War. For centuries, Laos existed quietly between larger and more powerful neighbors. Landlocked and mountainous, it sat between Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and China. Rivers cut through thick jungle and rugged highlands. Villages dotted the valleys where rice could grow, and farmers guided water buffalo through muddy fields at the start of each planting season. Life here unfolded slowly. In the early morning light, farmers stepped into rice paddies as mist lifted from the water. Buddhist monks in saffron robes moved silently through villages collecting alms. Children followed dusty paths between wooden houses, while elders sat beneath stilted homes weaving baskets or repairing fishing nets. It was a way of life shaped by land, tradition, and patience. But the nation itself stood on fragile ground. Centuries earlier, Laos had been part of the kingdom of Xang, often called the land of a million elephants. Over time, that kingdom faded, and by the 19th century the region had been absorbed into the French colonial empire as part of French Indochina. When the Second World War ended and colonial rule across Asia began to unravel, Laos emerged as an independent kingdom in 1953. Officially, it declared itself neutral, but neutrality proved difficult to maintain during the Cold War. By the mid-20th century, the world had divided into competing ideological camps. On one side stood the United States and its allies, committed to preventing the spread of communism. On the other were communist movements supported by the Soviet Union and China, seeking to reshape governments across Asia. Laos, though small and sparsely populated, sat beside a country already deeply involved in conflict, Vietnam. In neighboring North Vietnam, communist leaders were supporting revolutionary movements throughout the region. To them, Laos was more than a neighbor. It was a strategic corridor. Hidden within its remote mountains and jungles ran a network of trails and supply routes that would soon become infamous. The Ho Chi Minh Trail. To American military planners observing events in Southeast Asia, this system of paths and roads represented a serious threat. Supplies moving along these routes were sustaining communist forces fighting in South Vietnam. If the trail remained open, many believed the war in Vietnam might never be contained. But there was a difficult obstacle. Laos had been declared a neutral nation by international agreements. Foreign military forces were not supposed to operate within its borders. Any large-scale intervention risked violating those agreements and escalating tensions on a global stage. Yet the supply routes continued to expand. North Vietnamese forces gradually extended the trail network deeper into Laotian territory. Roads were cut into steep hillsides. Bridges appeared over remote rivers. Through dense jungle, supplies, food, weapons, medical equipment moved steadily southward. To officials in Washington, allowing the system to operate freely was not an option. If the trail could not be stopped openly, it would have to be challenged quietly. And so began a war conducted largely in the shadows. The situation inside Laos itself was already unstable. Following independence, the country's political system struggled to maintain unity. Rival factions competed for power. Royalists loyal to the monarchy, neutralists hoping to avoid Cold War alliances, and the communist Pathet Lao movement, which maintained close ties with North Vietnam. Coups and counter-coups shook the fragile government. In the capital, Vientiane, political leaders debated alliances while diplomats attempted to preserve neutrality. But far from the capital, in the mountains and countryside, the conflict was already taking shape. The Pathet Lao gained influence in remote regions with support from North Vietnamese advisors and troops. For American policymakers, The risk seemed clear. If Laos fell entirely under communist control, it could strengthen the broader network supporting revolutionary movements across Southeast Asia. The idea often referred to as the domino theory, that one country's political shift could trigger others, strongly influenced strategic thinking at the time. Yet direct military intervention remained politically difficult. So the United States turned to covert methods. The organization that would play the central role in this effort was the Central Intelligence Agency. Instead of deploying large numbers of conventional troops, the CIA began organizing an unconventional force inside Laos. Many of its recruits came from the Hmong people, an ethnic minority living in the mountainous northern regions of the country. For generations, the Hmong had lived in scattered highland villages, adapting to the rugged terrain and difficult environment. They were farmers and hunters, deeply familiar with the mountains they called home. Some already distrusted the Path Lao and North Vietnamese presence moving into nearby areas. American intelligence officers saw an opportunity in that local knowledge and determination. Under the leadership of a Hmong commander named Vang Pao, a guerrilla force gradually took shape. Villagers received military training. Young men joined units, capable of moving quickly through terrain that outsiders found nearly impossible to navigate. Airstrips began appearing in isolated valleys. One of them, known as Long Tieng, would become one of the most secretive military bases of the Cold War. Officially, it did not exist. It appeared on almost no maps. Yet at its peak, it was among the busiest airfields anywhere in the world. Aircraft arrived constantly. Cargo planes delivered weapons, supplies, and food. Helicopters transported soldiers and evacuated the wounded from battle. Zones scattered across the mountains. To the outside world, the base was invisible. Inside Laos, it had become the center of an expanding conflict. Throughout the 1960s, fighting intensified across the country's rugged northern landscape. The Hmong forces, supported by the CIA, engaged in a difficult guerrilla campaign against the Path Lao and North Vietnamese troops. Battles often unfolded along remote mountain ridges where control of a single hill could shape the balance of power across an entire region. But combat on the ground was only one dimension of the war. High above the mountains, another force was transforming the conflict: American aircraft. Because the war remained officially secret, many bombing missions were flown by planes without clear military markings. Pilots sometimes wore civilian clothing rather than standard uniforms. Some flew for airlines that were, in reality, covert CIA operations. Their main target was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In an effort to disrupt the supply routes running through Laos into Vietnam, the United States launched one of the most extensive aerial bombing campaigns in history. Day and night, aircraft dropped explosives across large sections of the country, especially near the eastern border where the trail system wound through dense jungle. Between 1964 and 1973, more than 2 million tons of bombs were dropped on Laos. The scale was extraordinary. In total, it exceeded the amount of bombing carried out by the United States during the entire Second World War against Germany and Japan combined. Across the countryside, the effects were visible. Cratered hillsides marked where explosions had torn through the land. Forests were damaged or cleared. Some villages disappeared entirely. For pilots high above the jungle canopy, the landscape often appeared empty, a vast stretch of green with little sign of human life. But on the ground, communities had lived there for generations. Farmers working in their fields, sometimes heard aircraft approaching long before they could see them. Families hurried toward shelters dug into hillsides. Children waited quietly beneath wooden floors as distant explosions echoed across the valleys. Some of the weapons used in these missions were cluster munitions, devices that released many smaller explosives over wide areas. While some detonated immediately, others remained in the soil. Those unexploded devices would remain long after the war ended. In the northern highlands, the Hmong soldiers fighting alongside American advisors faced enormous challenges. Villages became vulnerable as front lines shifted. Families often had to relocate again and again as battles moved across the mountains. Many young men joined the fighting before they had reached adulthood. For them, the war was not an abstract geopolitical struggle. It was a fight unfolding in the very landscapes where they had grown up. A young fighter might stand on a mountain ridge, watching the jungle below for approaching forces. Above him, aircraft crossed the sky, part of a much larger strategy aimed at disrupting distant supply lines. This was the daily reality of the secret war. As the years passed, the human consequences continued to grow. By the early 1970s, hundreds of thousands of civilians in Laos had been displaced from their homes. Many families found themselves living in refugee settlements or relocating to unfamiliar regions. The Hmong population endured especially heavy losses. Many fighters were killed during years of intense conflict. and countless families were separated as villages were abandoned or destroyed. Outside Laos, however, the scale of the war remained largely unknown. American newspapers occasionally mentioned covert activities, but the full extent of operations inside the country was hidden behind layers of secrecy. Even within government institutions, knowledge of the conflict was often limited to small groups of officials. Still, secrets rarely remain hidden forever. By the early 1970s, the broader war in Vietnam was reaching a turning point. Public opposition to the conflict was growing in the United States. Investigations and leaked documents gradually revealed details about covert operations across Southeast Asia. The war in Laos was no longer entirely invisible. But by that time, events were already moving toward conclusion. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, formally ending direct American involvement in the Vietnam War. As the political situation shifted, support for covert operations in Laos quickly declined. Bombing missions stopped. American advisors and intelligence officers began leaving the country. For the Hmong forces and other allies who had relied on that support, the situation changed rapidly. Without external assistance, their ability to continue fighting became increasingly difficult. The Pathlao, supported by North Vietnam, steadily expanded their control. By 1975, they had taken power across the country. The monarchy was abolished, and Laos became the Lao People's Democratic Republic. For many who had fought alongside American forces, the future was uncertain. Thousands of Hmong families fled across the Mekong River into Thailand, hoping to find safety. The crossings were often made at night, with families carrying children and whatever possessions they could manage. Refugee camps soon formed along the border. From those camps, many eventually resettled in countries including the United States, France, and Australia, bringing with them memories of a war that most people in their new homes had never heard about. Inside Laos, the physical traces of the conflict remained. Bomb craters filled gradually with rainwater and vegetation. Some farmland became dangerous because unexploded ordnance still lay buried beneath the surface. Even years later, farmers occasionally encountered remnants of the war while working their fields. In this way, the legacy of the secret war extended far beyond the years when the fighting ended. International organizations and local teams have spent decades working to locate and safely remove unexploded bombs scattered across the countryside. Progress has been made, but the task remains immense. Millions of unexploded cluster munitions are still believed to be hidden in the soil of Laos. Each one is a quiet reminder of a conflict that was once hidden from the world. Yet the story of the secret war is not only about destruction, it is also about memory. Over the decades that followed, veterans, refugees, historians, and journalists slowly assembled the history of what had happened. Documents were declassified. Personal accounts were shared. Researchers reconstructed events that had once been buried behind secrecy. Gradually, a clearer picture emerged. A small neutral country caught between global powers. A covert army built in remote mountain villages. A bombing campaign of unprecedented scale. And a generation of people living through a war that, for years, officially did not exist. Today, visitors to Laos often encounter a country known for its calm beauty. Temples overlook quiet riverside towns. Monks walk through morning markets. Boats drift along the Mekong as the sun sets behind distant hills. But beneath that peaceful surface lies a deeper history. In rural fields, warning signs still mark areas where unexploded ordnance may remain. Local museums display fragments of aircraft and rusted bomb casings recovered from the land. Older villagers remember a time when aircraft filled the sky and distant explosions echoed across the valleys. In Laos, history is not only preserved in archives or museums, it is written into the landscape itself. The Secret War reminds us that some of the most consequential chapters of history are not always the most widely known. They unfold quietly, in remote places, shaped by decisions made far away, and their consequences can continue long after the headlines have faded. More than half a century has passed since the bombing campaigns ended. Yet the story of Laos during those years still challenges simple explanations of war, power, and secrecy, because when events are hidden, understanding them becomes far more difficult. And when understanding is incomplete, the lessons of the past can easily fade. Somewhere in the mountains of Laos, a farmer still walks carefully across his field, watching each step. Beneath the soil lies the memory of a war the world once struggled to see. And it raises a quiet question that still lingers. How many other stories remain buried in the quiet places of our world, waiting to be understood?